Fading in from black, the camera pans over the grim, overcrowded streets of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942.
The air is thick with the cries of the hungry, the shuffle of weary feet on cobblestones slick with rain and despair. A young woman, her face etched with quiet determination, clutches a worn leather medical bag as she approaches the guarded gates. German soldiers eye her suspiciously, but her papers, marked with the insignia of a health inspector, grant her passage. Little do they know, inside the bag isn't just bandages and vials. It's hope, hidden in the form of a sedated infant, destined for a life beyond these walls. Imagine a world where the simple act of carrying a medical bag could mean the difference between life and death, not just for the sick, but for an entire generation. In the heart of Nazi-occupied Poland, during the darkest days of World War II, one woman turned her nurse's kit into a lifeline for thousands. Her name was Irena Sendler, a Polish social worker and nurse whose quiet heroism defied the machinery of genocide. She didn't wield guns or command armies. Her weapons were cunning, compassion, and an unyielding belief that every child deserved a chance to survive. But as the war raged on, her secret operations would push her to the brink, testing the limits of human endurance. This is the story of how one nurse's medical bag hid the most powerful weapon against tyranny, the future itself. Let's step back to the beginning, to understand how an ordinary young woman became the architect of one of the most daring rescue operations in history. Irena Stanislava Krzyżanowska was born on February 15, 1910, in the quiet town of Otwock, just outside Warsaw. The air in those early years was crisp with the scent of pine forests and the distant hum of a growing city, but her family life was marked by a profound sense of duty. Her father, Stanislaw Krzyżanowski, was a physician, a man who treated the poorest of the poor, including many Jewish patients shunned by others due to the rampant anti-Semitism of the time. He worked tirelessly during a typhus epidemic, ignoring the risks to himself. If you see someone drowning, he told young Irena, you must jump in to save them, whether you can swim or not. Those words would echo through her life like a mantra.
Tragedy struck early.
In 1917, when Irena was just 7, her father succumbed to the very disease he fought against, typhus, contracted from his patients. The loss was devastating, leaving Irena and her mother Janina in financial hardship. But in a twist of fate that revealed the interconnectedness of kindness, Jewish community leaders, grateful for Stanislav's selfless care, stepped in to fund Irena's education. It was a gesture that planted seeds of solidarity deep in her heart. Growing up, Irena witnessed the rising tides of prejudice in Poland, but her father's legacy steered her toward empathy. She studied Polish literature at Warsaw University, where she joined left-leaning groups advocating for equality. There, amid the bustling cafes and heated debates, she honed her voice against injustice. By the 1930s, Irena had found her calling in social work. She joined the Warsaw Social Welfare Department, where she provided meals, clothing, and financial aid to the city's most vulnerable, often Jewish families facing discrimination. The work was grueling, long hours in cramped offices, visiting homes reeking of poverty and despair, but it fueled her. She married Mieczysław Sendler in 1931, though their union would later falter amid the chaos of war. As Hitler's shadow loomed over Europe, Irena's path took a more perilous turn. In September 1939, German forces invaded Poland, unleashing a blitzkrieg that shattered the nation. Warsaw fell after a brutal siege, the skies filled with the roar of Stuka dive bombers and the acrid smoke of burning buildings. Irena, now 29, threw herself into relief efforts, distributing food and medicine to those displaced by the onslaught. But the Nazis' plans for Poland's Jews were far more sinister. In October 1940, they established the Warsaw Ghetto, a walled prison in the heart of the city, cramming over 400,000 Jews into a space of just 1.3 square miles. The conditions were hellish: streets lined with emaciated bodies, the constant wail of starving children, the stench of untreated sewage and disease. Typhus ravaged the population, killing thousands. Irena, leveraging her position in the welfare department, obtained a permit to enter the ghetto under the guise of inspecting for infectious diseases. It was a cover that allowed her to bring in food, medicine, and clothing, smuggled past guards who feared the contagion more than they suspected her motives. What she saw inside those walls haunted her. Families huddled in overcrowded apartments, their faces gaunt with hunger. Children, wide-eyed and ragged, played in the filth-strewn alleys, oblivious to the doom closing in. The ghetto was a living hell, Irena later recalled in interviews. People were dying in the streets, and the Nazis were deporting them by the trainload to death camps. The deportations began in earnest in the summer of 1942, with trains rumbling toward Treblinka, a name that struck terror into hearts. Over 250,000 Jews were sent to their deaths in just a few months. Amid this horror, Irena witnessed a pivotal moment that galvanized her resolve. In August 1942, Dr. Janusz Korczak, a beloved pediatrician and orphanage director, led his 192 children to the Umschlagplatz, the loading point for the trains. Dressed in their best clothes, they marched with quiet dignity, Korczak at the front, refusing offers to save himself. "You do not leave a sick child in the night," he said, "and you do not leave children at a time like this."
Irena watched from the shadows, tears streaming down her face.
Korczak's sacrifice inspired her to join Zagota, the underground Polish council to aid Jews, formed that same year. This clandestine group, operating under the nose of the occupiers, became her base for what would become her life's mission: rescuing Jewish children from certain death. Zagota was a beacon of resistance in a sea of complicity. Funded by the Polish government in exile and Jewish organizations, it provided forged documents, hiding places, and escape routes. Irena, codenamed Jolanta, headed the children's section. Her team, mostly women, risked everything. Under Nazi law, aiding Jews meant death for you and your family.
Yet they pressed on.
The rescues began small but grew bolder. Irena would enter the ghetto daily, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, ostensibly filled with vaccines and antiseptics. But inside, concealed compartments had sedatives, false papers, and sometimes even tiny infants, drugged to silence their cries. Picture the tension of those moments, the bag's leather creaking under her arm as she approached the gates, her heart pounding like a war drum. Guards, rifles slung lazily, would wave her through, their fear of typhus overriding suspicion. Once inside, she'd meet desperate parents in shadowy apartments, the air heavy with the smell of mold and fear. "Give me your child," she'd whisper, knowing the agony of that choice. Mothers, tears carving paths down dirt-streaked faces, would hand over their babies, whispering names and prayers.
"Will I see them again?" they'd ask.
Irena could only promise to try. One such rescue involved a baby boy named Elżbieta Fikowska. His mother, facing deportation, entrusted him to Irena. Sedated with a mild sleeping potion, the infant was placed in a toolbox, hidden among bricks in a cart leaving the ghetto. The jolts of the wheels over uneven stones must have been torturous for Irena, every bump a potential betrayal. But they made it out. Elżbieta survived, later reuniting with his story. Older children required different tactics, disguised as typhoid victims, wrapped in sacks, or smuggled through sewers reeking of waste and rats. To mask the cries of waking babies, Irena trained a dog to bark on command. A sharp tap on its leash, and the animal's yaps drowned out any whimpers, fooling the guards. Ambulances, with hidden compartments under the floorboards, ferried groups out under the pretense of transporting the dead. Coffins, too, served as unlikely vessels of life, carrying children instead of corpses. Each escape was a high-stakes gamble, the air electric with danger. One wrong glance, one suspicious noise, and it could all unravel. Once outside, the children were given new identities, forged baptismal certificates turning them into Catholic Poles. Irena placed them in convents, where nuns taught them prayers and customs to blend in. Ave Maria, Grazia Plena, the little ones would practice, their small voices echoing in stone chapels scented with incense. Others went to foster families, ordinary Poles risking their lives to harbor strangers. Irena kept meticulous records, names, original families, new placements, all scribbled on tissue paper, rolled into jars, and buried under an apple tree in a friend's garden, right near German barracks. It was her insurance policy for the future, a buried treasure of identities waiting for peace. By late 1942, Irena's network had saved hundreds, but the net was tightening. The Gestapo, those shadows in black leather coats, grew suspicious of the health inspector who came and went so freely. Whispers of betrayal circulated in the underground. Meanwhile, in the ghetto, the resistance stirred. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising loomed, a desperate stand against annihilation. But for Irena, the real battle was personal. Each child saved was a victory, each one lost a scar on her soul.
As winter's chill gripped Warsaw in 1943, the knocks came in the dead of night.
Gestapo agents burst into her apartment, the door splintering like thunder. They tore through her belongings, searching for evidence. Irena's heart raced. Had she hidden the latest list in time? Her friend, quick thinking, tossed the jar out the window to a waiting ally below. Captured, Irena was dragged to Pauiak prison, where the screams of the tortured echoed through cold stone corridors. What followed was unimaginable pain. They beat her savagely, breaking her legs and feet with clubs and hammers. The agony was searing, like fire coursing through her veins. "Tell us the names," they demanded, their voices laced with venom. But Irena, drawing on her father's words, revealed nothing. Sentenced to death, she awaited execution in a cell dank with the smell of blood and fear. But Zagota, ever resourceful, bribed a guard. On the day of her supposed death, she was pulled from the lineup, marked as executed in records, and smuggled out, her broken body hidden in a sack. Limping and in hiding, Irena assumed a new identity, Klara Dabrowska, and continued her work from the shadows. As a nurse in a public hospital, she sheltered 5 more Jews, tending their wounds while nursing her own. The war ground on, the Allies advancing, but Warsaw would pay a heavy price. In 1944, the the city rose in uprising, only to be crushed, reduced to rubble amid gunfire and explosions. After the war, Irena unearthed her jars, reuniting as many children as possible with surviving relatives. Many had perished in the camps, but the saved ones, now young adults, carried her legacy. Honored by Yad Vashem in 1965 as righteous among the nations, she lived modestly until 2008, always insisting she was no hero.
I could have done more, she said humbly. This regret will follow me to my death.
But as the Nazis closed in tighter, Irena's operations faced their greatest threat yet.
A betrayal from within? The final push to save the last children before the ghetto's total liquidation?
What happened next would test her unbreakable spirit. The cold Warsaw winter of 1943 had settled in like a shroud, frost etching cruel patterns on the windows of the ghetto's crumbling buildings. Inside the walls, the deportations had slowed to a grim trickle after the mass transports to Treblinka the previous summer, but the air still carried the metallic tang of fear and the faint, ever-present rot of starvation. For Irena Sendler, codenamed Jolanta, the work had become more desperate, more intimate. The ghetto's population had shrunk from over 400,000 to perhaps 60,000 souls clinging to life amid the ruins. Parents, hollow-eyed and trembling, pressed their children into her arms with whispered goodbyes that broke something inside her every time. "Take him," one mother might say, voice cracking like thin ice. "Just promise me he'll know his name someday." Irena could only nod, throat tight, as she slipped the child into her medical bag or a hidden compartment in an ambulance. Her methods had grown bolder, born of necessity. The church on the ghetto's edge, with its dual entrances, one inside the barbed wire, one on the Aryan side, became a vital conduit. Children would enter as frightened Jewish kids, hearts pounding, then emerge minutes later as baptized Catholic Poles, new papers clutched in small fists. Through the sewers, dark and foul with the stench of effluent and decay, older children crawled on hands and knees, guided by resistance couriers who knew every twist of the underground maze. Ambulances, ostensibly carrying typhus victims, rumbled out with living cargo concealed beneath stretchers or in false bottoms. And always, the medical bag, her constant companion, held more than syringes and gauze. It cradled sedated infants, their tiny chests rising and falling in drugged silence, wrapped in blankets to muffle any accidental sound. The network expanded under Zagoda's umbrella. Irena coordinated with nuns in convents across the countryside, where children learned to cross themselves and recite the Lord's Prayer in flawless Polish accents. Foster families in quiet villages took in the older ones, teaching them to blend into the rhythms of rural life, milking cows at dawn, helping with harvest, while hiding their true origins like buried treasure. Each placement required forged documents, bribes for silence, and monthly payments scraped together from underground funds. Irena's role was central, matching child to hiding place, delivering money and medicine, checking on their welfare under the guise of a visiting nurse. She moved like a shadow through the city, her limp from old injuries barely noticeable under the weight of her determination. But danger stalked her every step. The Gestapo had informants everywhere, collaborators paid in food rations or promises of safety. Whispers reached Irena that her name had surfaced in interrogations. She ignored them, pressing on. By mid-1943, her lists, scribbled in tiny code on fragile tissue paper, grew longer. She sealed them into glass jars and, with a trusted friend, buried them under an apple tree in a garden on Lekarska Street, right across from German barracks. The irony wasn't lost on her. The tree's branches would bloom pink and white each spring, indifferent to the secret sleeping beneath its roots. Those jars held the real names, birth dates, parents' names, everything needed to restore identities if the war ever ended and survivors remained to claim them. Then came the night that changed everything.
October 18, 1943.
The knock was sharp, insistent. Gestapo boots on the landing outside her apartment at 6 WWII Street. Irena's heart slammed against her ribs. In that frozen instant, she acted. She thrust the latest bundle of lists and money to her friend Janina Grabowska, who stuffed it under her clothing.
The door burst open.
Black-coated men flooded in, ripping drawers, overturning furniture. They found nothing incriminating, thanks to that quick handoff, but they dragged Irena away anyway. "You're coming with us, Jolanta," one sneered, using her code name like a curse. Pauiak prison awaited. The infamous fortress in the ghetto's ruins reeked of damp stone, blood, and despair. Interrogations began immediately. They beat her with rubber hoses and clubs, targeting her legs and feet until bones cracked like dry twigs. Pain exploded white-hot through her body. She bit her lip until it bled to keep from crying out.
Names, they demanded. The children.
The network. Hours blurred into days. They dangled her by her broken feet from a hook, the agony so intense she nearly blacked out.
Yet through the haze, Irena clung to silence.
She gave them nothing. No names, no locations, no betrayals. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Jump in to save them, whether you can swim or not. Sentenced to death, she was moved to a holding area for execution. Zygota, frantic but resourceful, mobilized. Maria Palista, a fellow welfare worker, gathered funds. Through back channels, they bribed a guard, likely with a fortune in zlotys or gold. On November 13 or January in some accounts, as Irena was led toward the firing squad with other condemned prisoners, the plan unfolded. The guard pulled her aside at the last moment.
"Go," he muttered.
She limped away into the shadows, officially marked as executed on the prison rolls. Zygota had saved her life.
Now a ghost in her own city, Irena assumed the identity of Klara Dabruska.
She went underground completely, hiding in safe houses, her broken legs bandaged and aching constantly. The pain never fully left her. She would walk with a cane for the rest of her life, but neither did her resolve. From hiding, she resumed coordination of the children's section. Messages passed through couriers, funds flowed to convents and families. Rescues continued, though at a slower pace as the ghetto's liquidation neared completion. By early 1944, Zygota's records showed hundreds of children still under care, some 300 supported directly by the department in May of that year. Irena, working from the shadows, ensured payments reached foster parents, that medical needs were met, that no child was abandoned. The city itself was unraveling. In August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising erupted, a desperate Polish bid to liberate the capital before the Red Army arrived. Streets became battlegrounds, barricades of rubble, sniper fire cracking through the air, buildings collapsing in thunderous clouds of dust. Irena, still in hiding, witnessed the horror from afar. Zygota's network fractured under the chaos. Many couriers were killed or captured.
The apple tree garden survived the bombardment, the jars undisturbed beneath the scorched earth.
When the Soviets finally liberated what remained of Warsaw in January 1945, after the Nazis had systematically razed the city in revenge, the streets were a wasteland of twisted girders and ash. Irena, limping through the ruins, returned to the garden. With trembling hands, she dug up the jars. The papers inside, though damp and fragile, held the names of the saved. She began the long, heartbreaking task of tracing survivors. Many parents had perished in Treblinka, Majdanek, Auschwitz. But for those who lived, scattered, displaced, searching, she offered reunions where possible. Some children, raised as Catholics, chose to stay with their foster families, others reclaimed their heritage. The jars had preserved hope. Irena Sendler's wartime odyssey didn't end with liberation. The children she saved, estimates vary, but her network is credited with helping at least several hundred directly, and up to 2,500 through broader Zygota efforts, carried her legacy forward. She lived quietly in post-war Poland, working in orphanages, always modest about her role. "I could have done more," she often said, eyes distant with memory.
"This regret will follow me to my death."
Yet in the annals of resistance, few stories burn brighter. One woman's medical bag, smuggled courage, buried secrets, and unbreakable will defy an empire bent on annihilation. The children she saved grew into adults who built lives, families, futures, living proof that compassion, even in darkness, can outlast evil. As the war's echoes faded, Irena's story remained largely untold for decades, buried like those jars, until a new generation rediscovered her. What happened when American students unearthed her legacy, bringing her quiet heroism to the world stage? The years after the war were not kind to Irena Sendler. Warsaw lay in ruins, 70% of the city reduced to smoking rubble, streets unrecognizable under mountains of debris. She walked those shattered avenues with a pronounced limp, the legacy of Gestapo torture etched into her bones. The pain was constant, a dull fire in her legs that flared with every step, but she bore it quietly, as she bore so much else. She returned to social work, first in orphanages and children's homes, tending to the war's smallest victims, Polish and Jewish alike, whose families had been torn away. Many of the children she had saved were now scattered across Poland, some still in convents or foster homes, living under names that weren't their own. Others had been reclaimed by surviving relatives, fragile reunions marked by tears and tentative embraces. In the immediate post-war years, Irena focused on practical matters, securing food rations, arranging medical care, helping displaced families rebuild. She divorced Mieczysław Sendler in 1947. The strains of war and secrecy had eroded their marriage, and later married Stefan Zgrzemski, with whom she had a daughter, Janina, born in 1947. Yet her thoughts often drifted back to the buried jars, those fragile repositories of identity. She had preserved what she could, but time and trauma had blurred many details. Some parents never returned from the camps. Some children, raised as Catholics, grew up knowing little of their origins.
Irena carried the weight of those unfinished stories like an invisible burden.
Recognition came slowly, almost reluctantly. In 1965, Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the Holocaust, honored her as righteous among the nations. A tree was planted in her name in the Avenue of the Righteous on the Mount of Remembrance in Jerusalem. She traveled to receive the medal at the Israeli embassy in Warsaw, a quiet ceremony far removed from the spotlight. "I only did what was normal," she told those who praised her. "I could have done so much more." The humility wasn't feigned, it was bone deep. She lived modestly in a small apartment, surrounded by books and photographs, rarely speaking of the war unless pressed. Decades passed in relative obscurity. Poland under communism suppressed many stories of wartime resistance that didn't fit the official narrative. Irena's deeds remained largely a whisper among survivors and historians. Then, in the late 1990s, something extraordinary happened, an unexpected ripple from across the ocean. In the fall of 1999, in the small rural town of Uniontown, Kansas, population barely 300, a high school history teacher named Norm Connard gave his students an assignment for National History Day: find an unsung hero from the past and tell their story. 3 sophomore girls, Elizabeth Cambers, Liz, Megan Stewart, Laderfelt, and Sabrina Coons, were searching through Holocaust resources when they stumbled across a brief footnote in a Jewish publication. It mentioned a Polish woman named Irena Sendler who had smuggled Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. The name meant nothing to them at first. No one in their class had heard of her. Schindler's List had made Oskar Schindler famous. Why had this woman remained unknown? Intrigued, the girls began digging. They wrote letters, made phone calls, scoured libraries. Piece by piece, the story emerged: the medical bag, the sedated babies, the buried lists, the torture, the rescues.
They were stunned.
How could someone save so many and no one knows? Liz later recalled. They decided to turn the research into a short play titled Life in a Jar, a reference to the glass containers hidden under the apple tree. The script was simple but powerful. Scenes of the ghetto's despair, Irena's daring entries, the heart-wrenching goodbyes, the Gestapo's brutality, and finally, the post-war hope of reunions. They performed it first at local competitions, then regional ones.
Word spread.
The play won awards, drawing audiences who wept openly. In 2000, the girls, now joined by others, took the production farther, to state, then national levels. They corresponded with Irena herself, now in her late 80s, frail but sharp-minded. Letters flew back and forth across continents. Irena, touched by these American teenagers from a place so different from her own, sent them encouragement and small details to enrich the script. "Tell them about the dog that barked," she wrote once, referring to her clever ruse to cover infant cries.
The impact was profound.
In 2001, the students traveled to Poland for the first time, performing Life in a Jar in Warsaw. They met Irena in person, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a cane, living quietly. She embraced them, tears in her eyes.
"You have given me back my life," she told them.
The girls visited the sites: the remnants of the ghetto wall, the street where her apartment once stood, the garden where the jars had been buried. They walked the path she had once taken, feeling the weight of history settle around them.
The project snowballed.
The play was performed hundreds of times: schools, churches, civic groups across the United States and beyond. A website launched, drawing millions of visitors. Media picked up the story: newspapers, television, documentaries. In 2007, Irena was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, though she did not win. Schools and streets in Poland were named after her. A book, Life in a Jar, The Irena Sendler Project by Jack Mayer, chronicled the students' journey and Irena's heroism. The girls from Kansas, as they came to be known, became ambassadors for her legacy, speaking of courage, tolerance, and the power of one person to make a difference. Yet debates lingered over numbers. Irena herself had spoken of saving 2,500 children, a figure repeated in many accounts. But post-war research, including detailed analysis by historians like Anna Bykont in her book Sendler, In Hiding, suggested the direct rescues attributed to her network were closer to several hundred, perhaps 400 to 500, though Zagoda's broader efforts aided thousands.
The exact tally remains elusive, lost in the chaos of war and incomplete records.
What mattered, Irena always insisted, was not the count but each individual life preserved. Irena Sendler lived to see her story circle the globe, carried on the voices of those Kansas students who had, in a way, rescued the rescuer from obscurity. She passed away on May 12, 2008, at age 98, in a Warsaw nursing home. Her funeral drew survivors, now elderly themselves, along with dignitaries and ordinary Poles. Yad Vashem issued a statement of mourning. She risked her life to rescue hundreds of Jewish children.
Flowers piled high, candles flickered.
Her daughter Janina accepted tributes on her behalf. In the end, Irena's medical bag, simple leather, worn from use, had carried more than medicine or hidden infants. It carried defiance, compassion, the stubborn belief that humanity could endure even the worst darkness. The children she saved grew into doctors, teachers, parents, artists, ordinary lives made possible by extraordinary risk. And the jars, once buried under an apple tree, had been unearthed not just in soil, but in memory, ensuring that her quiet war against evil would echo for generations. Today, Her tree still stands in Jerusalem's Garden of the Righteous, its branches reaching toward the sky. Visitors pause there, reading the inscription, feeling the quiet power of one woman's choices. In Kansas, the Lowell Milken Center preserves the legacy through exhibits and programs. The play continues to be performed, reminding new generations that heroes are not born in capes or with swords, but in the courage to act when others turn away. This is the story not just of rescues in a time of genocide, but of how memory itself can be a form of resistance. How a footnote in a book, discovered by teenagers half a world away, can bring light to a hidden corner of history. How one nurse's ordinary bag became an instrument of extraordinary salvation, and how, decades later, that same story inspired others to carry the torch forward. And so the legacy endures, in the lives saved, in the stories told, in the simple truth that even in the deepest night, a single act of kindness can change everything. The years following Irena Sendler's death on May 12, 2008, at the age of 98, have seen her legacy grow from quiet remembrance into a global symbol of moral courage. Her funeral in Warsaw drew a cross-section of Polish society. Survivors she had helped save, now in their 70s and 80s, stood alongside dignitaries, historians, and ordinary citizens who had come to pay their respects. Candles lined the streets, flowers piled against the simple coffin. Yad Vashem issued a statement of profound loss, calling her one of the righteous among the nations, whose actions had preserved lives amid unimaginable evil. Her daughter, Janina Zgrzemska, accepted the tributes with the same understated grace her mother had always shown. In the years since, memorials have multiplied across Poland and beyond. A tree bearing her name still stands in the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, its branches a living testament planted during her 1983 visit to Israel. Her Righteous Medal and certificate, along with other personal items, now reside in the permanent collection of Warsaw's Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, displayed prominently where visitors can reflect on the intertwined histories of Poles and Jews. In 2013, an avenue in Warsaw's Muranów district, near the Polin Museum and the Ghetto Heroes Monument, was named for her in a ceremony attended by Poland's president, the mayor of Warsaw, and Janina herself. Plaques mark key sites, one on the wall of the former clinic on Pawinska Street where she once worked in social welfare, another on the building at 6 Ludwicki Street where she lived until her arrest. Even in her childhood town of Otwock and in Piotrków Trybunalski, where she spent formative years, commemorative markers honor her memory. The story's reach extends far beyond Poland. The Life in a Jar project, born in that Kansas classroom, continues to thrive through the Lowell Milken Center for Unsung Heroes in Fort Scott, Kansas. The center houses what is described as the world's premier Irena Sendler exhibit: artifacts, photographs, documents, and interactive displays that bring her world to life for school groups, researchers, and visitors. The play itself remains in circulation. Schools and theater groups around the world perform it, often as part of Holocaust education programs. The foundation behind it still hosts presentations, outreach events, and educational resources, ensuring that new generations learn not just the facts of the Holocaust but the example of individual action in the face of atrocity. What began as 3 teenagers' research project has become a lasting bridge between continents, connecting American students to Polish history and Jewish survival. The question of numbers lingers as a poignant footnote. Irena herself often spoke of 2,500 children saved, a figure that appeared in early post-war testimonies, Zagota reports, and many public accounts. It symbolized the scale of the effort and the network she coordinated. Yet careful historical analysis, including the extensive research by journalist Anna Bykont in her 2017 book Sendlerowa in Hiding, published in English as Sendler, in Hiding, and reviews by Polish Holocaust scholars, has refined the estimate. Direct rescues tied to Irena and her closest collaborators, through her children's section of Zagota, appear closer to 400 to 500 children, based on surviving documents, testimonies, and financial records of support provided to hidden youngsters. Zagota as a whole aided thousands more Jews in various ways, but the precise tally for any single rescuer remains elusive amid wartime chaos, lost records, and the deliberate destruction of evidence. Irena never sought credit for numbers. She measured success in each child's breath, each life extended. Many of those saved did survive to build futures. Some reunited with surviving family members in the painful, hopeful years after liberation. Others, raised in Polish Catholic homes, chose to remain with their foster families, carrying dual identities into adulthood. A number emigrated to Israel, the United States, or elsewhere, where they raised children and grandchildren who now know the story of the woman who risked everything for them. Reunions, when they occurred, were often tearful and tentative, strangers bound by blood and memory meeting across decades. Survivors have spoken publicly of their gratitude. One man, saved as an infant in a toolbox, described meeting Irena in her old age and feeling, for the first time, the full weight of what had been done for him. Irena Sendler's life reminds us that heroism rarely announces itself with fanfare. It arrives in ordinary moments: a medical bag slung over a shoulder, a whispered promise to a terrified parent, a jar buried under an apple tree in wartime Warsaw. She did not seek glory, she sought only to act when inaction meant death. "Every child saved with my help," she once said, "is the justification of my existence on this earth, and not a title to my glory." Today, as anti-Semitism and intolerance flare anew in various corners of the world, her example endures as both warning and inspiration. The medical bag that once hid sedated infants now stands as metaphor, for compassion concealed in plain sight, for quiet defiance that outlasts tyrants, for the stubborn persistence of human decency. The children she saved grew into lives she never fully witnessed but helped make possible. Their descendants carry forward the thread she wove in darkness. In the end, the story of Irena Sendler is not merely about what one woman did during the Holocaust. It is about what any of us might do when history demands a choice. It is about how a single act, repeated in courage and secrecy, can ripple outward to touch countless futures. And it is about memory itself, how stories once buried can be unearthed, retold, and carried forward, ensuring that the light she kindled never fully fades. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's quietest, most powerful acts of resistance.